A waitress married her ruthless billionaire by force, until he whispered, "You're trembling." I love it. What if the very moment that changed everything started with a trembling coffee cup and a whispered apology? Grace Chen had served thousands of customers in her 8 years at Maple Street Diner, but none had ever made her hands shake quite like this. The porcelain rattled against the saucer as she approached table 7, where Daniel Rodriguez sat reading financial reports with the intensity of a man who owned half the city. She'd seen his face in the business section countless times, but up close, those dark eyes held something she hadn't expected, loneliness that mirrored her own. When she accidentally spilled cream into his black coffee, she expected anger, maybe a complaint to her manager. Instead, he looked up and said quietly, "It's okay. Sometimes the sweetest accidents happen when we're not trying." That simple kindness, delivered in a voice rough with exhaustion, planted a seed that would grow into something neither of them saw coming. "Where are you watching from tonight?" Grace lived in a world of early morning shifts and aching feet, where every dollar mattered and dreams felt like luxuries she couldn't afford. At 36, she'd learned to find joy in small things: Mrs. Patterson's daily stories about her grandchildren, the way sunrise painted the diner windows gold, the satisfaction of a perfectly balanced breakfast plate. Her small apartment above the flower shop might not be much, but it was hers, earned through countless hours of "coffee's ready" and "have a wonderful day." Daniel Rodriguez, at 42, inhabited a different universe entirely. Corner offices, private jets, and boardroom decisions that affected thousands of jobs. Yet for all his success, he found himself returning to that small diner week after week, drawn by something he couldn't quite name. Maybe it was Grace's genuine smile when she remembered he preferred wheat toast, or how she never treated him differently despite knowing who he was. In a world where people wanted things from him, she simply wanted to make sure his coffee stayed warm. Their conversations began innocently enough. "How's your day starting?" she'd ask, and he'd find himself telling her things he never shared in board meetings, about his father's small restaurant that inspired his first business, about missing the simplicity of cooking for people who were hungry rather than managing profit margins. Grace would listen while refilling sugar dispensers, sharing her own stories about helping her elderly neighbor with groceries or the community garden she'd started behind the diner. But Daniel's world was complicated in ways Grace couldn't imagine. His business empire had enemies, and his latest acquisition had made him a target. When threatening letters began arriving at his office, his security team insisted on precautions. That's when everything changed. The morning Grace served his usual coffee, Daniel's hands were shaking worse than hers ever had. "I need to ask you something," he said, his voice strained with desperation she'd never heard before. "And I know it sounds impossible, but I need you to trust me." The words that followed would challenge everything Grace thought she knew about kindness, sacrifice, and the lengths people go to protect those they care about. "They're threatening to hurt anyone close to me," Daniel explained, his coffee growing cold as he struggled to find the right words. "My lawyers found a way to protect you, but it requires—" He paused, watching her face carefully. "Grace, I need you to marry me. Not for real, not the way you'd want, but legally. It would put you under my security protection and make you untouchable." Grace's world tilted. Marriage to a billionaire sounded like a fairy tale, but the fear in Daniel's eyes told a different story. "What aren't you telling me?" she asked, her waitress instincts reading the tension in his shoulders, the way he avoided her gaze. "The contract would be binding for 2 years. You'd have to live in my penthouse, attend events, play the part of my wife. You'd be compensated generously. But Grace—" His voice broke slightly. "You'd be giving up your freedom, your life here, everything that makes you who you are." The kindness she'd grown to treasure in their morning conversations suddenly felt heavy with obligation. Grace looked around the diner that had been her sanctuary, at Mrs. Patterson waving from her usual booth, at the community bulletin board covered with thank you notes from neighbors she'd helped. "Why me?" she whispered. "Because you're the only person who sees me as just Daniel, not as Rodriguez Industries. And because—" He reached across the table, his fingers brushing hers. "Because I think I'm falling in love with you, and that terrifies my enemies more than any business deal." The proposal wasn't romantic, it was desperate, practical, and completely overwhelming. But as Grace watched this powerful man humble himself for her safety, she saw something that changed everything. Beneath the expensive suit and calculated words was someone as lonely and scared as she'd been most of her life. "I need time to think," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. "Of course. But Grace, I need an answer by tomorrow. They're escalating, and I can't risk your safety any longer." That night, Grace sat in her tiny apartment, staring at the life she'd built piece by careful piece. If this moment touched your heart, please give the video a thumbs up. The next morning's sunrise would bring her answer, but she already felt the weight of a decision that would change everything she thought she knew about love, sacrifice, and what it meant to protect someone you cared about. Grace's answer came not from her head, but from her heart when she found her apartment building surrounded by men in dark suits the next morning. Someone had been asking questions about her, following her routine, taking pictures. The fairy tale had become a nightmare before she'd even said yes. At the diner, Daniel was waiting with documents and a security team that made her small workplace feel like a fortress. "I'm so sorry," he said, and she could see the guilt eating at him. "This is exactly what I was trying to prevent." "Then we do this," Grace said simply, signing her name with shaking hands. "But I have conditions." The next weeks blurred together like scenes from someone else's life. Grace found herself in a penthouse that could have housed 20 families, wearing clothes that cost more than her monthly rent, learning to navigate a world where every smile was calculated and every conversation was a potential business deal. The hardest part wasn't the luxury, it was watching Daniel transform into the ruthless businessman everyone expected him to be, except when they were alone. In private moments, she glimpsed the man who'd worried about her safety, who remembered she liked her coffee with just a touch of honey, who still asked about Mrs. Patterson's grandchildren. But as the threats escalated and the pressure mounted, even those moments became rare. "You're not sleeping," Grace observed one night, finding Daniel on the terrace at 3 a.m, city lights reflecting off his tired eyes. "I keep thinking I've trapped you in a life you never wanted," he admitted. "You were happy at the diner. You had a community, a purpose. Now you're here playing dress-up for photographers and pretending to love a man who's brought nothing but danger into your life." Grace moved closer, close enough to see the exhaustion carved into his features. "Do you want to know the truth about why I said yes?" she asked softly. "It wasn't just about safety. It was because for the first time in my life, someone thought I was worth protecting." The vulnerability in her voice broke something in Daniel's carefully constructed walls. "Have you ever faced something like this? Let us know in the comments." When he pulled her close, Grace felt the tremor in his hands, the same shakiness that had marked their very first encounter. "You're trembling," she whispered against his shoulder. "I love it," he replied, and for the first time, those words meant everything they were supposed to mean. The threat that had brought them together finally showed its face on a Tuesday evening when Grace was returning from her weekly visit to Mrs. Patterson. She'd insisted on maintaining that one connection to her old life, despite Daniel's security concerns. The men who cornered her in the parking lot made it clear this visit would be her last if Daniel didn't step down from his latest acquisition. But Grace had learned something in her weeks of living in Daniel's world. She was stronger than anyone, including herself, had ever imagined. Instead of cowering, she memorized faces, license plates, and every word they said. When Daniel's security team arrived, she had evidence that would finally identify their tormentors. "You could have been killed," Daniel said, his hands shaking as he held her in the safety of their penthouse. "But I wasn't," Grace replied firmly. "And now we know who they are. Now we can fight back." The next morning brought the climax neither of them had expected. Instead of hiding behind lawyers and security teams, Daniel made a choice that surprised everyone. He went public. At a press conference with Grace by his side, he announced their marriage and explained the threats they'd been facing. The business world might respect ruthlessness, but the public responded to love and courage. "My wife represents everything good about the American dream," Daniel said, his voice strong with conviction. "She built a life through hard work and kindness, and I'll be damned if I let anyone threaten her because she chose to stand with me." Grace watched the man she'd married transform one final time, not into the cold businessman or the desperate protector, but into someone entirely new. A person who'd learned that true strength came from vulnerability, that the best business decision he'd ever made was choosing love over fear. The threats evaporated under public scrutiny and federal investigation. The men who'd terrorized them were arrested, their network dismantled by authorities who'd been trying to catch them for years. But the real victory wasn't in their capture. It was in watching Daniel discover that he didn't have to choose between love and success, that Grace's presence made him not weaker, but infinitely stronger. If you've been enjoying this story, subscribe to our channel for more heartwarming tales. As they stood together on their penthouse terrace that evening, watching the city lights twinkle below, Grace knew their real journey was just beginning. The contract that had brought them together was about to expire, but the love they'd found was just getting started. 2 years later, Grace stood in the same spot where their story had begun, behind the counter at Maple Street Diner. But this time, she wasn't just serving coffee, she was serving hope. The diner had been transformed into a community center and cafe, funded by the Rodriguez Foundation and staffed by people who understood that sometimes the most important conversations happen over a warm meal and a listening ear. Mrs. Patterson still came for her daily coffee, now bringing her great-grandchildren to hear stories about the waitress who became a philanthropist without ever forgetting where she came from. The community garden had expanded into a network of urban farms that fed families throughout the city. Grace's small apartment above the flower shop had become transitional housing for women rebuilding their lives. Daniel had changed too, in ways that went deeper than any business transformation. The ruthless edge that had once defined him had softened into determined compassion. He still ran his empire, but now every decision was filtered through a simple question Grace had taught him to ask: how does this help people build better lives? On this particular morning, as Grace refilled coffee cups and Daniel reviewed plans for their latest community initiative, she noticed his hands weren't shaking anymore. Neither were hers. The trembling that had marked their beginning had been replaced by the steady confidence that comes from finding your purpose. "Do you ever miss it?" Daniel asked during a quiet moment, gesturing toward the luxury that had once surrounded them. They'd kept the penthouse but spent most of their time in the modest apartment above the diner, close to the work that fulfilled them both. "Miss what?" Grace laughed, wiping down a counter that had seen thousands of conversations like this one. "The marble floors? The fancy clothes? The photographers following us everywhere? The simplicity of just serving coffee without changing the world," he said, smiling at the impossibility of his own words. Grace reached across the counter and took his hand, the simple gold band on her finger catching the morning light. Their second wedding had been nothing like the contract signing. Just them, Mrs. Patterson as witness, and promises made with full hearts instead of desperate fear. "What I learned," Grace said softly, "is that changing the world starts with a single cup of coffee, a moment of kindness, a choice to see someone for who they really are instead of who they're supposed to be." Daniel squeezed her hand, understanding that their story had never really been about a billionaire and a waitress, but about two lonely people who'd found courage in each other's trembling hands. If you enjoyed this story, please remember to like, leave a comment with your thoughts, and subscribe for more heartwarming tales. Sometimes the most beautiful love stories begin not with grand gestures, but with the simple decision to be kind to someone whose hands are shaking just as much as yours. Thank you for joining Grace and Daniel on their journey from fear to love, from isolation to community, from trembling to strength.